Hello and welcome to the News Club podcast, where we talk about the news and, more importantly, what to do about it. So it's Debs with me again this week, and we're joined by Dave Boyle, a long-time cooperative organiser and leading expert in community shares. Dave has worked with countless groups, in particular cooperatives, to take pubs, football clubs, local services and cultural spaces into community hands. And he's done so through community shares, which is going to be the discussion of today, which in summary is a tool that lets ordinary people pool resources to take back control of different kind of organizations, services, etc. So in this episode, we're going to dig into this kind of form of coming into community ownership and financial support within that space and the many possibilities it opens up for our communities and a more democratic economy. But first, in a couple of sentences, who are you, Dave Boyle?
Great question. My therapist is currently working through those questions with me at the moment. I live in Brighton. I grew up in the north of England, and I used to work for a sporting NGO looking to help take football clubs into community ownership. The last 3 years I was there, I was chief executive of that organisation, and then I had a spat with the Daily Mail and was soon looking for new employment and fell into cooperative consultancy because like a lot of people who would situate themselves on the left, I kind of had good vibes around cooperatives but didn't really understand what it was all about. But they were kind of good things, and it was through working in the sports sector that I got to really get under the skin of cooperatives, and they got under my skin. And as a result, it was a happy when you suddenly become unemployed and you're like, what do I do? Not, never mind for the rest of my life. What do I do to pay my mortgage next month? And there was a consultancy program specializing in working with cooperatives back in 2011 when this all happened. And I fell into that program and started working with cooperative enterprises. And then through that, I really got into community shares and sort of began to specialize in that from about 2015 onwards. And for the last 10 years, I've been doing mostly that kind of thing. And there's a few other sort of side hustles I've got, but most of the time I'm doing community shares. And since starting that work, I've basically done about 80 share offers, which have raised about £28 million for a variety of organisations across the UK and across so many different sectors.
That's quite the CV you've got there. And it's funny
Thank
because I
you.
think there's especially in the cooperative world, it's like you're a known figure, you're a known, support of co-ops and of community shares offer when and where they happen. So it's always brilliant to kind of hear that once again. Now, this is the question I ask everyone at the beginning of the podcast, which is because obviously we're a podcast that predominantly is concerned with media and news, but not necessarily always in the most traditional ways, right? It's also about exploring like different means in which we can start to be part of that process of disseminating information and kind of critically engaging with how we can kind of recreate those systems in which we are sharing information. I like to open with this question of what should be headline news but isn't. What would you want people to actually know about if it was in your power to be able to decide the headlines?
I think the biggest thing, I mean, there are so many things which you would want the world to know, but I think the biggest thing I'd want them to know is how much they agree with each other about most things and how few the people are who agree with the things which continue to be the stuff of political economy. If people genuinely knew that 93% of people thought private education was abhorrent and shouldn't be allowed. Private healthcare was the same. If the people knew that on average around 80% of people would like most of privatized utilities to be taken back into public ownership in some form. The continued veil which gets pulled over and turns these into matters of controversy when they're actually settled issues as far as the public are concerned. The politics we have reflects the communication apparatus we have. Sorry to sound like Dan Hind, but he's absolutely right. And the media would I would say, bear about 95% of the responsibility for the fact that the world is burning and we're turning against each other.
Yeah, yeah. No, I couldn't agree more. What do you think, Debs?
Yeah, there's an Australian Aboriginal writer that I really appreciate called Tyson Yunkaporta, and he talks about right story and wrong story, and he says wrong story is the most dangerous technology that we have in the world today because wrong story makes it impossible to deal with all of the other really harmful technologies that are taking us on a freight train toward an unlivable planet.
Preach.
Preach, preach indeed. But in the context of an unlivable planet, and for listeners who might be new to community shares, what exactly are they and what positive contribution have they made?
So, like much of the cooperative movement, I myself am a switherer between thinking, is there any point to this? And yes, there's lots of point to it. Because in the face of these kind of planetary level challenges, it can feel like, so what good does it do to take my local pub into community ownership? And yeah, in that scale, absolutely. It makes no odds whatsoever. And if your time is limited and you want to make a difference on these bigger impacts, then yeah, this is probably a distraction. But I tend to kind of think that you can't have too many people trying to make the world a better place, be it the local, personal level, regional, national, international, global. And the fight about whether we're all putting our energy into the right place feels like a fight I'd be happy to have later on down the line. But right now, more people doing good things, trying to make the world a better place in the place they find it, has to be a good thing. And that's where cooperatives fit in. They are kind of practical things which change the world for the people who get involved in making the cooperative happen. And I really like them because they contain within them the seeds for their growth. So if you look at the very first successful retail cooperative in Rochdale in 1844, their actual objects are glorious. The first one basically says there should be a shop which sell good stuff at fair prices. And then they talk about having factories to produce this. Then they talk about having housing for the people who are going to use these shops. And the fourth one is to reorder the affairs of the world. But it starts with just selling flour, which is not cut with chalk. And there is a really lovely kind of hop, skip, and a jump. It's not like you create the shop and then go, brilliant, we've got a shop. It doesn't sell unadulterated products. It sells them fairly. That's marvelous. Anyway, dear, what should we do this evening? It's all about kind of, and the next thing, and the next thing. So it starts local, but it has the seeds within it to become something much bigger. And indeed, the cooperative movement was enormous. It was described as the cooperative octopus, which bestrode the world and had tentacles on every continent. And so say all of us. But the community shares work I do is essentially about a bunch of people who are intervening in the market. A cooperative is ultimately an intervention in the market for the benefit of its members. And it's a bunch of people who are not going to let market or political forces tell them that that lovely building in their community, which could be used for something wonderful, should instead just become some flats, which are going to be unaffordable to most of the people who happen to live in that area. They refuse to allow decisions about the public realm, and the community shares really work in that interstices between private and public. It's those things which are traditionally privately owned but have public character. The third places, they used to be called. It's the places where we become communities. It's the places where we cease to be atomized individuals. And these spaces have been historically provided through private sector ownership. And in the face of neoliberal pressure, essentially, there's no money in making spaces for community to happen. And these places are being privatized. Essentially, they're being turned into smaller units, which can be given to individuals in exchange for a hod load of cash. Community shares are really brilliant mechanisms by which a community of people who go, no, this is not going to happen, this will not pass, who've recognized that it's often, sadly, because of the corruption of the political process, it's not enough to simply go, we don't want this, because the power will basically go, and so what? So that's the point where the communities go, we're going to have to be the people we're waiting for. We're going to have to organise to raise the capital we need to buy this damn asset. Would that we lived in a world where we could click our fingers and the state dropped some money, some acorns fall off the magic money tree, and this money enables these things to be bought. Even better if we could sequestrate these assets or appropriate them, but that's not the world we sadly live in at this moment in time. So you have to basically raise the money and take these assets off people through the legal process. And that's what community shares enable. It enables these spaces which have public character to be owned in a way which best reflects that public character on the basis of a democratic one member, one vote ownership structure, and keeps them in the service of that wider community need in perpetuity, or until the people who own them decide that they don't wish to own them anymore. And it starts very small. It started arguably back in 1844, but the current revivification of the community shares technology, as it were, begins in the early 2000s in a pub in Cumbria, where the community didn't want their last pub to close because the brewery who ran it realized actually this is worth more to us as a land asset, which we can turn into accommodation, than it is as a community asset. And the community said, we resist. And they resisted. They bought the pub. They then built a brewery next to it. And a few other people thought, this is an interesting idea. Like many things, 20 years pass. And over that time, it becomes more and more understood. And it moves from being the weird thing. Why? Because one of the big challenges with any heterodox intervention is, and going back to the media and communications, people go, I've never heard of this before. If it was such a good thing, surely I would have heard of it. And at that point, you go, well, actually, no. But we can't have a discussion at that point about representation and truth and media and what gets determined to be newsworthy. But we're past that point with community shares and things like pubs, for example, because there's been enough examples. It's been featured enough. People now know when their local pub closes, they can throw their hands up in frustration and anger, but equally better, they can roll their sleeves up and get organised. And there is a process which enables them to intervene successfully and win. And that's been really powerful. And that's kind of where we are with the community shares sector right now.
Absolutely. And it is really brilliant to see also just kind of different co-ops I've been with or I've also supported in those community shares, right? Like they're not as hard as you might think they are. Like I think once you get your head around it, you're like, oh, I just have to do a lot of admin and make a nice document. And then I think the numbers is where I get lost. And that's why we love
Yeah.
you, right? Because
Yeah.
you help co-ops do the strange numbers that no one quite understands and the predictions and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day,
Yeah.
like someone can do that, right? Like someone did that job and it's very viable. And I think it's really, really, really beautiful to be able to see and also know that it then supports such like brilliant, not just causes, but structures that then hold space. And what you were saying earlier in terms of this idea of it being able to kind of like magnify itself over time, that really feeling like it, well, that ultimately like emerging from the structure in and of itself. And I think for me, at the very least, like when I look to cooperative models and structures, for me, it's very much like this is a holding space that we would not otherwise have if
Yeah.
we did not invest time into creating it. Like this is very much like, when I think to even like, for example, you're talking also about like perhaps people who more directly challenge certain issues in the form of organizing campaigning, they use cooperative spaces. Like they'll use cooperative structures and there'll be so many, whether that's like housing co-ops or like worker co-ops that have like a space in which people can like exist in. It's interesting that I found this actually, that like not everyone realizes that, this space that is here took a whole lot of effort to create, right? Like this massive, wonderful living room that we have in this cooperative house is only like here because so many people put effort into making that happen, which then like facilitates other work and other places for other kind of organizations that aren't necessarily themselves cooperatives. And I'm really grateful that even exists. And I'm sure Debs, you've got quite a bit of experience on those kind of spaces as well, just with the activist background and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly in the housing co-op space, you're seeing a lot of the sort of more established housing co-ops also coming into that other bit, which is like this asset can also be a liability, and like actually the work of maintaining something, especially when the kind of not just the paying for it, but just the like coordination stuff, like it requires ongoing kind of collective commitment. And in a way, the community pub, that's an easier space to make that collective commitment happen than the housing co-op, where you've got a limited number of people that live there. And if there starts being a lot of turnover, it's actually very difficult to get people to be like, it's actually your responsibility to stop the roof from falling in. Like there's no one else here that's going to sort that out. I think I was going to say the story about like the pub and the local pub, and the trajectory of that over the last 30 years is so emblematic of like wider things around the way neoliberalism works. I remember working in a Green King pub when I was about 20, and the landlord was so horrible, and there were just a bunch of things going on that I didn't really understand. Like, it was a football pub, but he'd cancelled the Sky license. Like, what was going on there? And then another friend said, oh, this is what Green King do. They take on pubs which have more value as a land asset. Then they install a horrible landlord. They make a whole bunch of decisions which actually drive customers away. Then they say this isn't commercially viable. And then they say, well, now we're going to convert it into flats. And sure enough, like this building soon had a planning application thing put on it to see if they could convert it. And I think it was resisted by the community. And then, of course, you get this, there's fewer and fewer places for people to meet, more and more kind of isolation. I would be really interested to know if you could map the places where the far right is doing really well right now, and you could map where there are these community assets. Like, I wonder if in those spaces where people have continued to be able to like meet in spaces, do things together, feel a sense of local agency, that might be something that's kind of protective or means that people have more of a sense that this is, I don't know if that's true. They also could be meeting spaces for it,
Yeah.
if they're not in a Weatherspoons.
There actually has been some research, and it correlates pub closures with votes for UKIP. This was from about 2015, because they were the emblematic kind of, the emblem of nobody cares about this place anymore. And the corollary is nobody cares about you lot anymore. The other side to that does this resist that kind of politics if you've given people spaces to become collectively powerful and give them a sense of agency over the things, the idea that their community might have its best days still ahead of it rather than way, way behind it. That's really interesting. And there's been quite a bit of work being pushed forward by Power to Change, which is a think do tank, which is really pushing this idea that the solution, or one of the main solutions to the rise of the far right, is to re-empower communities. That said, there is a big challenge, is that because community shares require people who have capital, that kind of excludes a whole lot of people, myself included. I am not one of the capital holding generation. I own a house, but the building society owns it. At some stage I will maybe own it, but who knows? But I don't have any spare cash. All my money goes on food and rent, accommodation costs. There is a challenge that a lot of the places which are benefiting from community spaces being saved or revivified are places which are not in the immediate firing line. They're not red wall constituencies. They're actually either your inner city, urban, metropolitan, cosmopolitan communities, or they're pretty well heeled, which is not to say they're not going to fall victim to far right politics, but their story of arrival at that point is very different from the desperation end of the spectrum, which I think is driving a lot of the places where reforms seem to be waiting in the wings to become the next winners of constituencies there.
At that point, do you see community shares as being like a helpful tool within that environment? To what extent do you find that that's something that can play a part, given the kind of
Yeah.
financial circumstances?
If this is something which is going to have relevance in inner city communities or in deprived communities, it needs to be wedded to political power. And the jury is out, but there is a bill currently going to be making its way through Parliament, which will give communities the right to buy assets, as opposed to the right to say we'd like to buy that and be ignored, which is currently what they have. But the actual right, as exists in Scotland, where a community can say we want to buy that place and you have to sell it to us if we make the price. That's great. Giving them political power is going to be super helpful, but it also needs to be funded by grants, either from the state or from foundations, i.e. where there is lots of capital in existence already, needs to be redistributed to those communities to enable them to do this, because it's just fanciful to expect a bunch of people who are essentially on the breadline to then say, look at the empowerment which would be unleashed within your community if only you could raise £500,000. And it's actually it's insulting to say, here is a solution for you and your needs. It's a possible solution if other things, it's a necessary but insufficient condition to the empowerment in those communities. And I think it does have a real potential. But the main thing it's doing at the moment is giving an alternative narrative that people coming together can make change in the world. And the fact that not all of that change is replicable right now is It's like, I almost think it's like Wallace and Gromit, where he's sort of on the train and he's laying the trash in front of him. It's like, okay, we need to fix the next stage. People have become enthused. They've become seduced by this notion of them having collective power. Okay, what's the next thing we need to put in place to enable that to be activated? So the community shares work I'm doing at the moment feels very much at that kind of demonstrator phase. It's not all is lost. There are ways forward, and then working with other people is to then identify what do we need to help make that happen. So you take something like Ward's Corner in Haringey, they've created that sense of possibility, but they still need TfL and the local council to come together, because it's not enough to simply say, guys, you can create this organisation, you can raise capital, because the sum of money they need is in the millions. So that's just
Mm.
not going to happen with a bunch of precariously employed freelance workers who run market stalls and a wider community who really like that thing happening in their community.
And I guess on that, right? Because what you're kind of touching on there is its relationship to state ownership as well, and to like other actors. And so, within like the wider political context, do you very much see it as an addition to that context rather than some sort of like alternative, or do you see it being able to kind of pave a way to public ownership that isn't exclusively or necessarily like state ownership?
That latter is very much where I am, but I feel like it's about 20, 30 years down the line. There is a bigger conversation about what type of ownership, which if it's not private, what types of non-investor owned or extractive or exploitative ownership models work best. At the moment, the only game in town is really state ownership in some form or another. The cooperative movement always had grave reservations about the way the 1945 Labour government undertook public ownership and disempowered people and empowered bureaucrats. And I think that's still right. But that argument wasn't won in 1945. So why would it be won now when every arm of that argument is weaker? The forces engaged in that argument are weaker. If we say, let's not nationalise it under the department for X, Y, or Z. Let's cooperatize it. Some people will go, okay, what does that look like? And at that point, people like me are kind of like, don't know. It's just about, because we don't have answers, we don't have examples. So I think it's a distraction to then say, hang on a minute, we shouldn't be nationalising things. Actually, we should. And then once we've got them in public ownership, we have political power to then bring about a change in the way those things operate. And secondly, anytime there is a publicly owned asset, community ownership doesn't really work, because the community of people who don't want the asset to be denigrated in some fashion are split. There are a bunch of people who basically say this was a political decision by the local council to sell off this building, and a political decision can be unmade. We can lobby the council to take a different view. So it would divide the forces opposed to a denigration of a public space, to then have a fight amongst them about, should it be better for us to own it, through collective self-controlled bodies, or would it be better for us to continue to own it through the local authority? And whilst that fight happens, you lose. So it's better for things which are currently publicly owned, or are best publicly owned, better publicly owned than privately owned, are best in the hands of the state. And then we can have a discussion about what's the best format for them to be actually operated and managed. So yeah, I'm always really resistant when the cooperative movement is often pressed into service by violent elements of the Labour right, who see it as a solution which seems palliative and in accordance with their political view, but is actually setting it up to fail. It's privatisation, really. And I've always been very resistant of it, and I remain so for ideological and practical, tactical reasons.
Yeah, you've got a whole history of kind of Tory cooperative thinking, like the Philip Blond stuff, which was basically like, if you're rich, you'll have a nice service from the private sector, and if you're poor, you'll get a shit service from the cooperative sector.
Yeah. Yeah, and you can all volunteer, because everyone's got so much time on their hands.
It's the big society. I actually wrote a report on community business for Power to Change a few years ago. And I mean, a lot of what you actually see in that is lots of very different understandings of what this space of community business is, and whether people are understanding it as like a more community way of doing the public sector, a more kind of community oriented way of doing private sector, or that you're actually trying to bring private sector principles into the community sector.
Absolutely.
And the way that community is understood and defined, whether it's seen as a kind of thing that already exists and that is static and stable, and this is a natural expression of it, or whether you have a more critical view of it, really shapes how you see it. And particularly in a context where, when you're talking about, assets like a pub or a public space, whatever, there's a very obvious way that you would think of community in geographical terms. But then you have to factor in huge spatial inequalities. We obviously have inequalities that, people live side by side in hugely unequal ways. But there's a way that people live spatially unequally that means that the inequality can be quite invisible. Like, I live in Sheffield, in a city like Sheffield. The levels of poverty are actually quite invisible if you are living in a middle class area. They're often on the outskirts of the city. Transport in and out is very poor. And I think there's something there. I mean, the organization I work for, Opus, is kind of been thinking about new financial instruments, or like Sheffield bonds or something, where you actually create a mechanism where the richer and more middle class parts of Sheffield are putting money into things that would then fund grants towards assets in like the really deprived areas that, frankly, like middle class people in Sheffield never go to, have no idea what's going on there, cannot see what's going on, but those are the places which are currently draped in England flags.
I couldn't agree more. Living in Brighton, you've got exactly the same setup, only the addition is they've built the more deprived areas literally in hollows. So as you look across the downs, you can't see the sink estate, which is nestling in the base of the hollow. So literally people cannot see this deprivation, and there's only one road in and one road out. And I think that attests to the idea in Sheffield, attests, ultimately community charities is ultimately a technology. Before that, there's a software really, which is the solidarity pro-social. Yes, you've got the mechanisms to create means to redistribute wealth within localities outside of the taxation system on a voluntaristic basis. But that involves building a coalition of people who think that's a good thing. And that is, I kind of, the more I think about it, the more I think, Neil, it's ironic that the MAGA heads want to turn the clock back to the 1800s or the 18th century, because kind of we're already there in terms of, it's almost like we've got to completely rebuild what was called the progressive movement, the left. Because the structures which maintained and built and were the kind of fuel for the advances made in the 20s have kind of fizzled out. We've spent that fuel and we need to do something new. And I feel like we're back in that 1850s where essentially it's about trying to create this sense that we owe things to each other. I mean, it's really annoying that, that sign, that really quite irritating sign, I can't believe I have to protest this shit. It's like, actually, we've been having to do this nearly for 50 years because the clock's been slowly winding back on the sense of social solidarity, which underpinned so many of the advances which we take for granted and wish we lived in a world which had many of them still.
I was reflecting something similar with like another person I work with, and that like both of us as like young people, we're kind of reflecting on whether it was almost easier in the past, because I think we look to a lot of different examples of movements of solidarity, of power building and community wealth building. I guess perhaps in our experience we haven't necessarily been able to witness something as like that, or we're able to also treat the past as something that we can always like pick and choose, and we're able to kind of like pick things out and say, oh, that was cool, and why don't we have that now? And there are obviously things that are happening now, but definitely the environment in which it's happening is incredibly different. Even when I'm walking around, there are people who say hi and people who don't. When you're walking your dog, there's certain generations of people who still carry that sort of etiquette, and there are people that don't. And I think it really speaks to the kind of cultural ties that we are embedded in us, and slowly, generationally, starting to become more and more pulled apart. And obviously, everyone's experiencing increasing isolation, but it's in many ways I associate those social ties with a different cultural environment. And I think to myself, like, how do you recreate a culture?
Yeah.
How do you have it be something that can actually fizzle out so easily? Like, how do we have ties to each other in ways that can't be so easily eroded as they have been over the past 50 years, 100 years?
Well, I mean, my starting point is that if you look at the kind of 100 years from 1850 to, uh, let's say, 1870 to 1970 as an aberration, then you're back like, well, they were built up where they didn't exist to create that moment. I think one of the more interesting challenges, slightly fascinated with the growth of the cooperative movement in a kind of how did it start from nothing and become something? And the big thing, what jumps out to you is how much it piggybacked an existing cultural movement, which was nonconformist religion, and there were a bunch of people who had found a way to be co-religionists, but they were slightly persecuted, or at least second-class citizens, for their religious choices. But there was a bond of trust between them, because they were co-religionists who kind of were othered by the mainstream society, and that othering of them created a sense of joint identity, which then led to an expression of collective endeavor through cooperative. And it wasn't an exclusively nonconformist thing, and the cooperative movement was really clear not to badge itself as nonconformist, but it kind of knew that it was. And that's great, but it's like, okay, well, we don't have that religious practice uniting us all. Slightly, I don't know. I mean, I'm musing on, there are several things which give me a little, which are sort of like seeds. One is a generation of people are coming to consciousness who have a shared understanding with each other of planetary hell, and in a way that previous generations just didn't. It's a terrifying and tragic lingua franca shared, and I do wonder if that's got the potential for that kind of commonality. Another theory I've been working on, which I say working on, which is, you know, thinking about when walking my dog, is David Graeber's work on social organization. And it led me to thinking that his sort of insight, him and Wengrow's insight about how through 30,000 years of human history, there has been a consistent tendency to for a bunch of people to say, we don't want to live like this, and to create alternative governance structures for their societies. And then you think, how did this happen in so many different parts of the planet over such a long period of time? And you think it has to be in our heads. That's the only kind of common strand is our DNA. Everything else culturally has changed. And then I started to think, of course, cooperative movements are the political form for the neurodivergent. And and with the massively and welcome understanding of how essentially I genuinely believe that you know, if you thought of neurodivergence as a majority minority position, I think there are more of us than we realized.
Yeah, there's a TikToker that refers to diverse people and diversity as the neuro like majority more than anything,
Yeah,
actually. Yeah.
I genuinely believe that, and I also kind of, you know, you can almost see an evolution from an evolutionary biological perspective. It's really helpful to have somebody who goes, guys, I think the emperor's not wearing any clothes, or guys, I think that might actually really be a lion. And regardless of what our tribal boss says, I think he's a bit stupid. And I just think you can't get rid of this sort of notion that there has to be a better way. It's inside of us. And I think increasingly more of us are coming to realize that, or could do.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you link that with David Graeber because, yeah, to me, the thing around, David Graeber talks about bullshit jobs, and part of the thing with neurodivergence seems to be a common thread seems to be a real intolerance for bullshit,
Yeah.
that then makes operating, it's obviously very, very difficult to operate in a capitalist context where the majority of what you're doing in a lot of jobs is total bullshit. Like there genuinely just is a much better way to do this thing, or it's actually completely unnecessary and it doesn't need to be done at all. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, it makes sense that this thing of like other alternative economic structures being something which would feel like a better home for people who are like, I just want to not do bullshit all day long.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you're not doing the bullshit all day long, or you're kind of checking out of it, then it frees up an awful lot of neurological cycles to focus in on what alternatives could look like. And as we know, neurodivergent people can get into the flow and can organize some seriously impactful things in not a very long period of time. So I think that I'm going to continue to think about this, because it's just a little germ of an idea I've had.
I've really enjoyed that insight, genuinely. I think also it makes me think about how I work best. And I often come into this conflict where it's like I cannot like operate under like punitive circumstances. Like the best work that I do will always be the kind of thing that like I'm running at walls for, where I'm like, oh, I just need to do this thing and I need to do this thing. And especially when it's like socially tied as well, where it's like now I'm like responsible to make this happen, because if this doesn't happen, I'm gonna make a whole bunch of people disappointed, right? I'm talking about like even like running events, for example. And I really enjoy that. I really enjoy the environment in which our sources of motivation are really like our internal sources of motivation, that rather than like an extrinsic pressure to like survive, and one that is just completely completely stripped of joy. And I definitely think I would like to think that people will cultivate their own joy in the form of that kind of pushing back and saying, actually, like, this is the environment in which I want to work and live, and this is the kind of space that is going to make that happen. And so I like the
Yeah.
positive reflection.
The other thing I would add to that is that, in the same way that a younger generation who are not poisoned by the Cold War have rediscovered Marxism and all sorts of other isms, which are not tarnished with a kind of, don't go here, there, here be dragons, toxic, keep out. There's a bunch of people who are rediscovering cooperativism from its really basic starting point, rather than being slightly prejudiced by their parents or grandparents' understanding of a retail shop, which happened or may not have been on their high street. There are people who are increasingly realizing that when they talk about co-ops, if you talk to a bunch of boomers, they talk about the co-op. When you're talking about cooperatives and they talk about the co-op, talking to people in younger generations who aren't as burdened by the weight of that history, it means that they're really as many people know about Mondragon and Italian cooperatives in Emilia Romagna. In a way, that's as much as what summons to mind when they think about cooperatives, and they think about worker co-ops and housing co-ops, in a way that, especially in the UK, people haven't really done, apart from a brief flourish in the early 1970s. You're going back 100 years before people were thinking about this kind of stuff. So it's really welcome, and it's really great to have generations. On the downside, sorry, it's all gone terribly bad for you. On the upside, you're not as burdened by the weight of dull history. And
Mm.
I think your potential, your understanding of the potential is greater, and also your need to develop these things is greater. And you put those two things together, and that's the wellspring for the cooperative movement. A bunch of people who knew that it was kind of life or death if they didn't get this shit sorted.
And you know
Mm.
what, Gen Z, Helen, you're a spicy as well.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I genuinely didn't think like neurotypical people existed until this year when I met someone and I was like, actually, every single aspect of you makes me think that that is possible. Because I think anyone and everyone in my life in some way or another like displays some sort of divergency, like whether we want to pathologize that is a different thing. But it wasn't, I know one person that actually seems to be able to like have a really good schedule. And at that point, I'm like, actually, this is like wild to me. Like, it's actually like crazy that you function like that. Everyone else has their own little quirks. But anyways, I mean, I guess like even that individual does too. But returning to community shares and kind of like the last point, re your work in particular, what should listeners do if they want to support or start a community share project? Where should they go?
So I think anybody who wants to support a community shares project should know about it, because they're part of a community of people who are activating people like them to give us stuff about it. So I don't think you should be kind of going, this sounds neat, I'd like to support something like this, because you're not part of a community who's doing this, and that's not a good reason to be part of it. If people want to start this, there is loads of stuff online. Just Google community shares, and the main thing really is to find other people who care about something that you care about and are prepared to put in the work to do it. There are funding programs, there are guides, there are all sorts of help which can be accessed, but the wellspring is a bunch of people who are prepared to commit to each other, to building something, and have a confidence that if they can build it to a certain stage, they can also inspire other people to join them. So think about the possibilities. Think about the possibilities of owning something yourself, rather than simply shouting at somebody to keep it open. And just look, connect with other people who've done this. The other, like any pro-social movement, everybody who's already done something like this is more than happy to help, because they want to see this replicate, because they've been inspired and they want more people to feel the joy.
That's beautiful. Thank you for that answer. All right. Well, kind of wrapping it up to like the last questions that I ask everyone. The nature of a news club is basically the beginnings of hopefully something like that, whereby people come into a space together to talk about news and what to do about it. And it's the what to do about it bit that we're really focused on, because really it's just an excuse to have people in one space so they can maybe explore what's frustrating them, but then also really look to to the productive side of things and say, actually, like, what can we do about this? And as you've just articulated there, in many ways, like, this is a tool that people can maybe bring into that space and say, hey, like, this is something we can talk about. But say you were to enter a space with a group of people that, want to talk about stuff and then what to do about it, what would you bring? What idea would you bring? What physical object might you bring? What snack? What pet? What topic?
So, okay, so the thing I'd probably mainly try to bring to such a space would be news from a future which is unevenly distributed, where people have decided to do something positive and it's worked. There's no specific physical object. There's a book just been published, which is like a beginner's guide to cooperatives. Which is freely available online, which I will just get the title of it for you, because that's probably the thing I would bring, because it's called Cooperatives Linking Theory and Practice by a guy called
Yeah, we'll definitely share that.
by a guy called Ian Adderley, who moonlights as the head of the Financial Conduct Authority's registrar function for cooperatives. And he basically got to the stage where he was being asked all the time by civil servants, is there a guide you can give us, like an entry point into the cooperative movement? And he found there wasn't one. And that's one thing the cooperative movement is really bad at, which is selling itself. And it doesn't make these resources as easily available as it should. So that's a really good kind of deep dive. And the other thing I would bring people is probably, Cooperatives UK as the apex organisation for mutuals in the UK. They're the ones tasked with trying to communicate what's going on, and they've got really good case studies, really engaging and drawn from a variety of circumstances: worker co-ops, community co-ops, housing co-ops, which just kind of give people a sense that this is possible. Things can change, people's effort can be rewarded, and tomorrow doesn't have to be as dark as it is today.
Absolutely. And lastly, in 2029, we may live in a Europe and UK, and arguably already are living in a Europe and UK that is run by authoritarians. So, what is the one thing everyone should do leading up to 2029?
I get an Irish passport.
Brilliant.
That's my strategy.
What about you, Debs? What do you think we should all do?
Well, you've asked me this question so many times. I thought I wasn't going to have to answer it this time.
No, you have to answer it this time.
Well, one little action that I'm thinking of right now is everyone just get a flag that you feel some connection to that is not the George's Cross, and hang it outside your house. We're going to have a Zambian flag outside our house because Nadia's Zambian.
Brilliant. I might actually throw one or two out. Actually, that'd be pretty good. Okay, well, thank you so much, Dave. Thank you so much, Debs. This has been a really fun conversation. I'm
Yeah,
going to be
likewise. Thank you.
posting all about it. And I want people to listen to this because I think it's as big as a movement can be internally, like externally, I can recognize that it's still very, very niche. And so the more information that we can disseminate, I think the better. But anyways, thank you for listening. Check us out, News Club UK, as per usual. There's our bi-weekly newsletter as well. So make sure you subscribe to that, and any and all relevant links to anything community shares / Dave Boyle related, I will also be sharing as well. But anyways, thank you guys for coming, and I will end the recording there.